Hi there, it's Marcus here. October 15th, the day after the voice referendum. I was throwing a bit of a tantrum last night, I have to say. I was a little agitated and needed to vent a bit to some of my friends, but I'm reasonably recovered now. Doesn't take long to bounce back. But, sorry, this is an ideal opportunity to say, well, what are the uses for the History 300 thinking tools that we've been working on over this semester? Because they are useful and they will help us in understanding that historical event. Because it is historical, that means we're living in history. We actually experience history. And I want to reflect a little bit on some of these elements in this short talk. And I also want to, I guess, urge you to think about how the tools help you to make sense of the worlds in which you live. And I use the worlds plural intentionally because none of us live in the same world. We all live in parallel universes almost that sort of coincide occasionally, like when we all meet in a classroom somewhere or online. But it also helps us in practicing our chosen careers, history teachers, for instance, to make sense of complexity, make sense of the paradoxes, incongruities, but also to ask the kind of questions that help us gain deeper understanding. History is very much about human consciousness. How do we perceive the world? And that human consciousness is not static at all. It's not even a given, except that we're all aware that we have something called consciousness. But what does that actually mean? And also, what does it mean for us as historians? So let me launch into this short talk by sharing my screen, jumping up here to this one. That's the one I'm looking for. Yep, there we go. So, great painting by Francesco Goya there. I saw that when I was, 15 back in 1974. I was in Spain in the Prado Museum there. And of course, you can imagine as a 15-year-old, you go, oh, that's what an awesome painting. Now, Goya was an extraordinarily versatile painter, and he painted in this kind of loose mythic style, but he could also paint the most exquisitely photographic real photorealist images of the people who were his patrons, the Spanish clientele. The painting also appears on the front cover of this book that I was waving at some of you last week, called The Terror of History, which I haven't finished, but I've been thoroughly enjoying. Teofilo Ruiz is a wonderful historian, and we'll be touching on some of his work. So I want to talk about the voice in the light of this concept of the terror of history, and I'll obviously have to explain a little bit more what's meant by that. So before I start, though, I want to touch on another book. I'm going to be waving the books at you because all apart from one of the quotes that I use in this short talk, I keep saying short, maybe it'll be short, hopefully it'll be short. The celestial hunter, Roberto Calasso, one of my all-time favorite mythographers, he has this to say about what I guess Yuval Harari would call the imagined orders. And he's talking about Calasso because he's a mythographer, talking about the mythic. He's saying, look, the invisible is the place of the gods, the dead, the ancestors, the whole of the past. Yesterday's vote is reflective of the whole of the past, of the ancestors and the dead. It's because white Australians particularly, it's debatable how the Indigenous Australians see this. Some, of course, are grieving, but not all, because we could tell that even amongst Indigenous peoples, the yes-no was problematic. But the invisible is how do we as individuals and as communities relate to our pasts. Now, the word gods there isn't referring to God upstairs. It's the gods, it's the ancestors. We tend to describe these beings in terms of our folk heroes or our heroes from the past. We could pick, someone like Julius Caesar, or someone like Genghis Khan. They don't have to be nice gods, don't forget. We can also pick more local people like Burke and Wills or William Landsborough, the guy who settled down at the bottom of the hill that I live on. We could pick, and the gods are just significant people from the past. They happen to generally be dead, but not always. They are the ancestors and this whole of the past. And what do we do with that? Well, it doesn't necessarily require a cult, as in, worshipping those gods. But, I want to say that cult and culture are closely related words. They have the same root meaning, which means a practice. And modernity, the modern world of Australia, is, and nationalism itself, is a kind of cult. So think about that. So it doesn't necessarily require this kind of invisible, but it seeps into every crevice of the mind. That's what culture is. Our mind is a cultural machine, like a metal string. And I like this image. It need not vibrate. It can remain inert. But if it vibrates, the intensity can be convulsive, as in yesterday, and as in the vibrating in the lead up to the referendum. The invisible culture, memory, the past, whatever that might be, is not to be so far away. Indeed, it might even be too close, so close as to be found. The invisible ends up in each person's head. And I think this is something we need to understand. All the misinformation, all the fear, anxieties, also the high moral grounds from both sides, all that kind of rhetoric that comes with the politics of enacting culture and what it means to be an Australian and so on, is stuff that happens inside our heads. But as you know, and it's the very last point I make in this lecture, we are not isolated heads. We are organically, relationally interwoven with the entire cultural worlds that we inhabit, and culture doesn't exclude nature. So let's move to the next slide. Here's a photo. So the voice referendum, what can we say? Well, as I pointed out at the beginning, we live through history as fish live in water. That's what Calasso's meaning by it can be too close for us to even be aware of. And my tantrum last night was an emotional sort of convulsion, you might say. I wouldn't go that far probably, but I was pretty pissed off, simply because even though my rational mind would have been saying, sure, we were pretty much destined for the ditch, when actually you fall in the ditch, even though you might know you're going to fall in the ditch, it doesn't make it any easier somehow, does it? So, and of course, some of you may have voted quite happily no, and then we'll be wondering, what did you have that tantrum about? But imagine if the yes had got across and you had your tantrum no voters. Okay, so let's keep moving then. So this referendum is an example of high-profile history. Okay. For us, but not for anybody else, of course, because let's say Israel and Hamas, the Ukraine, climate change, they're all right up there. I was looking on some of my news feeds this morning. There was no mention in many of them, sorry, of our voice vote yesterday. It was all Hamas or, other nationalist stuff from other bigger nations than ours, or nations that are grabbing that high-profile space. But anyway, there is absolutely no doubt you might be doing it 20, 30, 40 years from now, historians will be unpacking this thing, the voice, and its surreal distortions for many decades to come. I mean, it's not just history. It's, well, how does the media function? Where does all that money come from for the No campaign? What is behind this going on here? There's so much happening in terms of the socioeconomics of who voted what. It was the wealthy middle class who voted more yes, whereas the working class tend to be more no. And they've got a bunch of grievances, of course, because it's getting harder and harder to be just to hold things together here. So the thought that you might be giving something away or giving somebody else a leg up when your leg is going down, probably into that ditch I was referring to earlier, then, we can start to understand the cross currents, and to make sense of that as a historian is to be a real task, but it will test and hone your skills as a historian. What is objectivity? What's subjectivity? Where do they play out? These are the questions that we've been asking ourselves across this semester, and they will hopefully not go away for you. I hope that you keep asking those questions decades to come. So, one way to understand the vitriol, the misinformation, and the distrust inspired by the No campaign, and there's a link, is through this question of, or this concept of the terror. Here, one of my favorite things when I was a kid, I also saw this when we were in Europe, this is a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, painted in 1562, but it's still very medieval in its feel and the way it's depicted here. And you've got Death over there on the horse with a scythe. What a fantastic looking thing. So that's pretty much, and all those people there going into that box, they're going to cast their vote for the voice, okay? Yes or no. So this is what it's all about. So what does Ruiz have to say? Well, he says, we live, as it were, always on the edge of the abyss. And when we think we are happy and at peace, as individuals or as communities, awful things may be waiting just around the corner. Cataclysms. Ruiz is focused a lot on the Middle Ages, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, famine and plague and human bestiality at its best, or worst, or whatever you want to call it, is what he's looking at a lot of the time. The witch craze, the saints and martyrs and the heretics of this period. This was, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. They were pretty horrible periods to be alive in. Tell you what, I would have opted any day as Australian at that time, because they knew nothing about the West and the West knew nothing about them. And life would have been tough, no doubt, for some, because life is tough. Wherever you are, that the edge of the abyss is always potentially waiting for us. So what does he have to say? Well, Ruiz follows this Johannes Huizinga, Jacob Huizinga, and I've been looking for his book. I've got so many, but I think I might have lost it. The Waning of the Middle Ages was a book that I've had since the late 70s. And it really is a very influential book, a beautiful cultural book. It's looking at the last centuries and decades even of the Middle Ages. And he sort of analyzes, and this was written in the 1930s, he analyzes that period through 3 lenses. So Ruiz suggests that there are 3 parts in dealing with this terror of history, that everything might come crashing down around us at any time. That is the terror, that life is contingent, life is uncertain, and that there is no necessary future for any of us. And Ruiz suggests, following Huizer, as I pointed out, that some turn to belief, Christianity, Buddhism, atheism, for that matter, it's a belief system, Marxism, whichever, we turn to something that helps us make sense of who am I, gives me something to hold on to, something that explains this mayhem that we're living through. Others here, Zinger and Ruiz both argue, turn to the senses, material consumption, this middle-class wonderland that we all live in, this land of plenty, which is Australia, but, also all the forms of hedonism that go with it. He describes it a lot using Boccaccio and the Decameron, which was one of the early pieces of literature written in the decades immediately following the Black Death and its first appearance, in which they're quite bawdy, sexy, erotic tales, because some people focused on the erotic. And, if I'm going to go out in a flash, well, I'm going to have a bit of a, song and dance before I do, that kind of thing. And the other thing is, possibly what I'm drawn to in some respects, is the culture and beauty, the cult of culture, the cult of beauty, the aesthetic response to the terror of history. Let's think of an example. During the Great Depression in Australia, as we were nation building, We were building a Parliament House in Canberra. We were also building the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Okay. These were expressions, local Australian expressions of an aesthetics of modernity. It gave us something to have national pride in. The War Memorial in Canberra, maybe some of you have been to it. It's quite a beautifully designed space. It's not just the building, it's a space. And it's a space that somehow conveys the sacred, which takes us to beliefs. Belief in nationalism. You may have lost a dad or a brother or an uncle or a mum or a son or a daughter in one of the major wars that Australia's been involved with. But you can go there, put a red poppy on their name tag in one of those areas. You may listen to the last post being played. There's something special about that, honouring that memory. Okay, so that's the third one, culture and beauty. I keep pressing that button and it doesn't change. Okay, so what are we doing here? Well, why are we doing history, and why am I talking about all of this stuff? Well, history is, in one way, an attempt to understand what's happened. What happened yesterday? Well, we're going to be trying to understand that for ages, but we can start making a few generalized comments now. So we're looking at the balance of objectivity with subjectivity. We can offer narratives of insight that free us a little, as I've often pointed out to you guys, from the blindness, the conditioning of social conditions themselves. The Australian Indigenous, like other oppressed peoples worldwide, demonstrate what Rebecca Solnit, got it here, another one of my books. This book's a terrific one, Hope in the Dark. It's only a thin one too. She makes some really great points, but she makes this point about African Americans. She says, look, Indigenous people, I'll go back actually, Indigenous people, well, like all the peoples in the world, women, people of gender differences, people of different ethnicities and so on, referring to the African Americans in particular, she says, describes as startling, resistant richness under all that poverty and oppression. And I see this all the time with Indigenous Australians, an incredible resistance to and challenging of the narratives that are imposed upon them. I'm not saying this is individuals. This is something that we can now see over the decades and last decades arising from Indigenous cultural renaissance, which is what I would call it. And that gives me a sense of hope. That's the Hope in the Dark. That's the title of her book, which she wrote actually 25 years ago or so. So, the strange working of history. That's where she ends it. The date is 2016, but that's the 25th anniversary, I think it is, of the first appearance of that book. So, one strand then, vibrating string of vibrancy and pain, which refers to the earlier quote from Calasso. We can refer to settler colonialism. This is a really powerful idea. I'm going to actually read these two quotes to you from this paper. And I'm putting up the paper along with this PowerPoint so that you can actually access the paper easily. And this is really helps me understand the strength and veracity, is that a word, of the No campaign. There is the settler colonial condition. Australia, along with the US, New Zealand, Canada, is a settler colony, an imperial formation where the colonizers are more concerned with settlement and Indigenous dispossession than the exploitation of labour and resources. In settler colonies, colonizers come to stay. Yet settler stasis has been, in practice, notoriously elusive. And that means stasis means the stability of the settler is elusive. Stability itself is elusive. The life of the settler is uncertain. To continue, although settlerism was imagined, I underlined that and bolded it because it's imagined orders, as a civilized antithesis to Indigenous nomadism, a curious hallmark of colonial settlers has been a lingering inability to settle in place. Settlers, to quote, were typically unsettled, and mobility was their defining characteristic. So that was one point she makes. A few pages earlier, I can see I forgot to actually add the page number. I think it's page 16, 17, something like that. She also makes this point. But this was not the only reason that settler colonialism engenders mobility. She sees it as a defining aspect of modernity. No less significant was the imperative to conquer territory, to process, a process that is ongoing. The vote yesterday, and I'm going to stop there for a moment, the vote yesterday was a re-imposition of that conquering mentality. It was a reassertion of our right as white settlers to dominate this land. We're not going to share it. Okay? That's something that I think comes across very clearly. So Georgina Claassen and Lorenzo Veracini insist that movement across space to displace and replace original sovereign lies at the heart of all settler societies. I'll say that again. Movement across space, okay, to displace and replace original sovereign owners, Indigenous Australians, lies at the heart of all settler societies. Real and imagined mobilities across stolen land were and are essential for settlers to claim Australia as their own. Real and imagined mobilities, okay, across stolen land are essential for settlers to claim Australia as their own. There is a right to be a settler. Settlers are better than, more civilized than, those whom they replace. This is an ancient way of legitimating a state of ownership. We can see the ancient Assyrians and Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, the Romans, all of them would come in and replace an Indigenous people, not necessarily wipe them out or displace them, but bring in a superior controlling culture. In this kind of settler colonialism that we experience today is only a few hundred years old. It was the British particularly who excelled at this. But what we can say, though, is that the settler colonial state is a state of unsettled settlers. That we still, as white Australians, do not feel comfortable in our own skins. There is something deep, deep down that is uncertain. Something deep, deep down that is aware of the trauma experienced by the past, in the past, displaced into the present and projected, especially with renewed energy, into the future as, you know, white supremacist types continue the spin. They'll be, drunk on the wind from yesterday and seeking to push that forward. It's all to be seen. So to me, then, this is an ingredient that is specific analysis, historical analysis of the past and its influence on the present. Helps me particularly, and I'm hoping it helps you, understand some of what's going on in this context of the referendum. So we can see that usurping legitimation then in itself is a historical process. The kind of histories we tell can often be histories that seek to legitimate, like Keith Windshuttle or whoever it might be, the historical project of colonialism. So we see in the voice the logics of modernity as a form of settler legitimation. We see reason linked, or a prisoner, to emotion and identity. The emotions around the referendum, my own tantrum last night, you know, all indicate how invested we are in our own skins, our own identities, our own narratives, okay? So we find truth and untruth dancing in a dialectic here, okay? And, you know, I made the mistake of looking on, where's my phone? It's over there, and looking on my phone just a couple of hours ago, and I turned to a reporter, name's gone out of my head, whom I particularly admire, and she is a reporter on the left, but that means that she's right. But no, she's a good reporter, and she's a very fair reporter, in my opinion. She made some comments about the no vote yesterday, and the amount of vitriol that was underneath that single comment was extraordinary. So this truth untruth stuff is very personal. It's very real. We can't just push it aside. So then we are forced to recognize the ongoing presence of trauma, the trauma of early white settlement, the displacement from the countries of our own origin. So there's displacement, discontinuity, and then the seeking to create a new form of continuity, but also the trauma of being actually consciously both the oppressor, but also in denial of our oppression. Okay, and I think there's interesting psychocultural or psychosocial elements to that denial. And that's deeply embedded in the Australian psyche. Okay, so I'm going to jump now to the Angel of History, whom you all met in about week, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, I can't remember now, with a thesis on history. And I want to read this to you because, to me, the Angel of History is back. The Angel of History we saw in action yesterday as the referendum played out. So this is from Walter Benjamin. It's in your course readings. It's number 9 of the thesis on the philosophy of history. And it reads, I'm going to read it to you now. It reads like this. A Paul Klee, painting named Angelus Novus, the new angel, shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. About to move away from racism and embrace a new potential future. But his eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. That's our aspiration. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has caught in his wings with such a violence that he can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned. While the pile of debris before him grows skyward, the storm is what we call progress. White colonialism, Australian nationalism, the nationalisms that are tearing Israel and Palestine apart, the nationalisms that are toxically flowing through the United States, in fact, many countries, China certainly, North and South Korea, Japan, could just keep on listing, the UK, of course. So what's happening here? Well, the angel of history, we can see that the angel of history was standing right next to me, probably, chuckling while I was in my tantrum last night. What do you make of that? It's something that I keep coming back to. I keep coming back to this particular quote, and many historians do, actually. It's a recurring leitmotif in historical discourse. So, what can we say? The terror of history. Look at this poor woman. She's having an existential crisis. So, old Ruiz, I've been following him on and off for quite a few years, and it's interesting to see how he, as a historian and thinker and a cultural commentator too, has evolved as well. He started out in his young days as a very crisp, clear Marxist of the Annales School. The Annales School, Mark Bloch, people like that, right? And Ruiz is now just in his early 80s, I think, still alive, and I've seen him soften, and he's now questioning some of his Marxist you could say atheistic assumptions. Not that he's becoming a Christian or a Buddhist or anything else for that matter, but he is softening and feeling into, perhaps because his own mortality is in front of him so much more strongly, or just that he's been dealing with this stuff with undergraduate students for decades, because he's a brilliant teacher too. He has this to say, and I think this is beautiful. I don't totally sit with it myself, but it's an extremely elegant example of thinking about the terror of history. Suspecting or knowing that there is probably no meaning or order in the universe, we combat this dark perspective by continuously making meaning, by imposing order on our chaotic and savage past, by constructing an explanatory schemes that seek to justify and elucidate what is essentially inexplicable. These half-hearted attempts to explain the inexplicable and to make sense of human what we call history. That's worth reading quite a few times, I suggest. I certainly have read it quite a few times, and I no doubt will continue to read it a number of times over the years to come. No meaning or order in the universe. Well, physicists would argue differently. But from a human perspective, a human cultural perspective, we are deeply vulnerable creatures who have created culture after culture, civilization, life way after life way, if we're not in that civilization game, that seek to give some form of meaning and purpose to our existences. I think that's really worth considering. So the mythic, that invisible, that Colosso talks about at the beginning is really worth considering. Our imagined orders, as Harari would say, give us a sense of why is this happening now? How do I know that my world, my reality, is in any way stable or given? Sorry, my cough is still lingering. So, what can we say about the practice of history? Because this is where we kick in. We start saying, okay, well, what can History 300 really do to help us understand all of this? So reading the voice result through an historical invites us to think about consciousness, that inner stuff that Colosso was talking about at the very beginning. Human consciousness is what goes on inside our heads, but it is also collective, a shared, negotiated experience of meaning-making that constitutes a reality of sorts. This reality is fragmentary. A truth and a lie can appear differently to different people, or even the same person at different times. I really think that the kind of struggles we have in questions, let's say, of Indigenous relations in this country are about becoming more alert, more aware of the relational depths that we are embedded in. Certainly climate change is about that. Global economics is about that. Social questions of justice are all about that. I'm going to continue to explore that in a moment. Thoughtful history understands this and seeks to work through the evolving insights we have into our world. In other words, history doesn't stop, as Tom Griffiths points out, and so does Elton, for instance, and others. It's a continuous engagement with human reality and the consciousnesses, plural, that actually shape our narratives around that reality. What can we say then? This is the second last slide. If we follow Rusin, for instance, we can see those 4 types of consciousness at work. Traditional history does not question the status quo. It legitimizes it. It offers us exemplary characters that represent the virtues of tradition. Ironically, those people who are challenging that tradition can also find exemplary characters. So exemplary history is bifurcated in that way, that represent alternatives. This is John Tosh at work. If we think, so there's those 4 consciousnesses that Rosen's talking about. I'm offering a critical / genetic analysis. If we look at the genetic, particularly, we have a lot of space for hope, actually, because there's so much stuff that's emerging now, coming out of, I've referred to the Indigenous Renaissance earlier on, these books here, Country, let's say, with Future Fire, Future Farming, Bill Gammage and Bruce Pascoe, white guy, Aboriginal guy. Song Spirals, that one's an awesome one where a group of women, they don't even sign it individually. Tyson Yunka Porter's, that's his older book. He's got a new one out, which I haven't yet gone and bought. Fantastic thinking there. Leaving Australia Behind, Becoming Kin, an America one, okay, Becoming Kin, is an Indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future. It's a very interesting, critical take on American Indigenous history. This one here from our own wonderful Deborah Dank, okay? She writes beautifully. We come with this place, just a beautiful, a really beautiful book. But again, understanding the Indigenous and taking us as partners into that understanding, us non-Indigenous particularly, there's something new happening in that space, that Indigenous futures space. Mentioning that, there's this awesome book here, Black Futures, okay, which is just an anthology of the most amazing thing, mostly focusing on Black futures from Africa, of course, Afrofuturism, as it's called, Indigenous futures relating to North America, Central America, South America, and so on. It's filled with great pictures too, and it's not that expensive actually. It looks like it should be. So to me, this is something that's giving me a lot of hope. In other words, and this links us up with moving from the genetic to Lukács, with new forms of narrative consciousness that are emerging. It's really important to understand that, there's a lot happening in that space. But you might choose, this is what I do, to look for things from a neo-humanist lens. That's linked there to one of my most recent articles called The Neo-Humanist Moment, okay? And it points to the evolutionary struggle to perceive the world relationally. To me, all of these books that I just waved at you are offering us new ways into thinking relationally about the human world. But I'm say a but going beyond that, I'm thinking now of books by other Indigenous and non-Indigenous writers, thinkers as well, like Braiding Sweetgrass by Kimera, Robin Wall Kimera is a very, very good example of that. Yeah, there's others. I'm just thinking, I've got a number of them lying around here. This one by our own, it's on the floor. It's a good book, and I haven't thrown it there. I've just placed it there, called The Microbial State. There are many ways of looking at the more than human and embracing that. So that sits at the heart of that neo-humanist stuff, which I don't push in this particular course. But as you get to know me and understand my thinking, you will see how that infiltrates or informs all that I'm on about, really. So, and then lastly, temporality, okay? And I've talked about temporality in one YouTube clip that I've given to you and another one called Past, Present, and Futures. Temporality itself is up for grabs. Modernity, the concept of progress, that Walter Benjamin's thesis is talking about progress as a kind of single linear flow, okay? That he says we see, the individual historian or thinker might see, as that happened there, the Russian Revolution followed by the Second World War, followed by, like that. That really what we're experiencing culturally is this whole flow or surge towards the now, the present. And that present is always marked by certain features of economic triumphalism, cultural triumphalism, technological triumphalism. That's progress. Oh, I have a new iPhone. It's an iPhone 24S, which of course is a decade or so away. But you can be pretty sure that we'll probably have an iPhone 24 at that sometime in the future, or that there will be, the latest, the newest Netflix and co will all be absorbed by some huge company that produces, entertainment, so we can be zombies all the time, just watching other worlds and other reality, but our own reality is rather, anorexic, you might say. So that leads me to a poem. Okay. So Walt Whitman. Oh, God, Walt Whitman. I love his book, The Leaves of Grass, which I've had for decades now. This is a poem about myself, he calls it. And it's filled with some level of paradoxes, but it's a great way to end. And I'll sort of talk into it as I read it to you. The past and the present wilt. Before, right up to the referendum, and now that past and present, that opportunity for an alternative future for now has closed down. And he says, I have filled them and emptied them. I've filled the past and now I've emptied it, and proceed to fill my next fold of the future. That's what I'm doing today in making sense of yesterday. Listener up there, what have you to confide to me? Look in my face while I snuff the sidle of evening, sidle to sidle up, to sneak up, as evening is approaching. Talk honestly. No one else hears you. It's happening in here, that space that Calypso talked about. And I stay only a minute longer because I'm off into the future. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. In other words, we're not a single consciousness. We are multiple consciousnesses, often talking backwards and forwards with us, and voices from other people that have invaded our heads, and so on. So if we contradict myself, good, he's basically saying. I concentrate toward them with a nigh. I concentrate toward them that are nigh, that's near. I wait on the door slab. Who has done his day's work? You? Have you done your day's work? Have you done your readings? Who will soonest be through with his supper? Are you coming to talk to me? Who wishes to talk with me? Will you speak before I am gone? Another voice of that multitude. Will you prove already too late? We're too late for the referendum yesterday, but there will be a tomorrow. The issues we face as unsettled settlers are monumental. They are planetary issues. They are complex in a way where we cannot really see and understand the full implications of how human consciousness must grow towards greater compassion, I would say, towards greater historical compassion too, to understand that the sins of the past were committed by hard people in hard times under immense pressure to survive and thrive. The sins of yesterday, literally yesterday, need to be understood in the same way. But there are other enigmatic questions that really intrigue me a lot. Questions about where did the money come from to fund the No campaign? So much clever spin was around that. These are other questions that are historical in nature, because consciousness grows out of friction, debate, conflict. What we're going through now is a long historical moment. In my paper, the one I mentioned in the previous page of the slide, I call it the neo-humanist moment, but you can call it any number of things. One of my colleagues, Ziad Ansada, talks about it as being post-normal. But that's all for now. I think I've done my thing. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to bid you all good evening. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in class for the last 2 weeks, because this is when we're going to tie it all together. And I really want to kick off by talking about this talk. So I'll be poking you to encourage you to have a listen to this before we actually meet face to face. Take care of yourselves and see you soon.